Now it's my pleasure to introduce Mois Navon. Mois is one of the founding engineers of Mobileye, where he designed the IQ family of SoC, System on a Chip, the chip powering the autonomous vehicle revolution. And as technology is taking its lumps in this session, we have to acknowledge that Mobileye is also a technology that saves many, many lives, as anyone who spends any time on Israeli roads can attest. Mois is also an ordained rabbi. He's published many articles in Jewish law and lore and works at the intersection of Torah Umada. There's a nod to the YU grads of us here in the audience. And he's currently pursuing a PhD at the Department of Jewish Philosophy at Bar-Ilan University. And his work focuses on using Jewish philosophy, applying Jewish philosophy to help us address the ethical questions arising in the field of artificial intelligence. And in addition to his professional work, also he teaches a course on ethics in big data and artificial intelligence at Ben-Gurion and at Yeshiva University. So we're delighted you're here, and please, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. Also, thank you, Yehuda and Professor Ben Pazzi, for putting this together and for inviting me to speak. I also would like to thank Nadav Berman, who's also my invisible advisor. Professor Ben Pazzi is my thesis advisor in reality, and Nadav helps me in the background. As you just heard, so I'm working at the intersection of AI and Jewish philosophy. What I'd like to speak to you about today is really what my thesis is focusing on, which is how do we interact with humanoid robots? Now, to answer this burning question, we really have to divide the question into two. There are what are known as mindless robots, basically your laptop on steroids, and then there are conscious robots, which was mentioned today. How far off we are from that or not is a big question. So what I would like to address today is actually that question of conscious robots. If we find a robot that looks like us, acts like us, speaks like us, and in fact has the consciousness that drives us, how do we interact with that? What is the moral status of that being? Now, I mentioned that this is a burning question. You're going to say, wait a minute, didn't Chava just say this is in some way off future? So if you look at these headlines, these are from 2 weeks ago. Google fires their engineer who claims its AI is conscious. It made the headlines of all the big press. They didn't fire Blake Lemoine. Blake Lemoine is the engineer who basically said that his NLP, his natural language processing computer, he interviewed it, and he felt that he got very human-like answers to the point that he believes it is human, it is conscious. Now, Google didn't fire him for just saying, I think my computer is conscious. They fired him because he sought legal aid to represent his computer against Google. Again, he might have gone a little bit too far. Basically, anybody in the know in AI knows that his computer is not sentient. These are just a few of the quotes. It's more likely that someone got a little too excited. That being said, conscious robots are the goal of AI. Since 1955, when John McCarthy, one of the founders of AI at the Dartmouth workshop, said, we want to build machines that can do everything that people can do. If that's a little bit ambiguous for you, so John Hagelin, in 1955, is a philosopher in the area. He said, AI wants only the genuine article, machines with minds. And Ray Kurzweil, the great inventor and futurist, says that people are going to have to get used to the idea of non-biological entities with consciousness. So since the 1990s, there's a whole new field of computer science. It's known as machine consciousness. There are people around the world trying to build conscious machines. They basically split up into two camps. There are the infocentrists and the biocentrists. The infocentrists are people like Alan Turing and Ray Kurzweil, people that say basically consciousness emerges from sophisticated computation. What we have between our ears is a supercomputer, and that's why consciousness has emerged for us. The minute we can build a computer that is as sophisticated and as powerful as our brain, consciousness will simply emerge. There are other people who say, no, there's a lot more going on between our ears than just a computation platform. Neurons are not just simple transistors flipping voltages or current, whatever you would like. There's actually a lot more going on in our brains. Neurons are powered by electromagnetism and chemistry and physiology. And if you want to have consciousness emerge, you're going to have to build a platform exactly like the brain. And there are people working on taking rat neurons and building neural networks in petri dishes, and it's already been done. But that brings us really to the moral question. So what is the moral status given or assuming that we build a conscious machine? And to understand that, so it was mentioned here already in Chava's lecture, the idea of moral agency. Moral status breaks up into two categories: moral agency, moral patiency. A moral agent is an entity that has the ability to plan, act, be responsible. Basically human beings. You don't have to be Immanuel Kant to be a moral agent, but it doesn't hurt. And then there's moral patience. So moral patients don't have all of these things. They're really entities that have the capacity to sense, experience, what some people call sentience. Basically, this category is occupied by the animal kingdom. And then you have inanimate objects, which are neither moral agents nor moral patients. So again, the question is, where does our humanoid robot that has consciousness fit in this moral matrix? To answer that question, we turn to what's called the ontological approach, or it's also known as the classic approach, the standard approach. Basically, ontology means, what is this thing in front of us? What is the essence of this thing? And once we know what it is, then we'll know how to behave with it. Mark Zuckerberg, who's also mentioned, he's a big name in the field, so he discusses this approach, and he says, look, if we want to know how to deal with this, how do we want to interact with this robo-dog, so we don't know. But let's look at a bio-dog. We know how to interact with it. And then let's see how much they have in common. If they're really the same, so then we will treat the robo-dog like the bio-dog. And if you look at these pictures, so externally, they look the same, they sound the same, they behave the same. So people like Mark Zuckerberg, they believe in ethical behaviorism. If they behave enough the same, so we will give them the same ethical platform, the same ethical consideration. However, there's other people that say, no, that's not enough. We need to look at the insides. Insides count. What's driving that behavior? Is it just a computer, or is there something more going on? Those same questions and that same approach apply to our humanoid robot. How close is the humanoid robot to a human being? So to answer that question, I put together a relatively long list of characteristics, criteria for humanhood. And basically, it's a very long list, but it breaks up into really three categories. The first category are things that make us Homo sapiens. They don't necessarily, if an alien dropped on this planet and wasn't born from a human mother and couldn't produce offspring from a human, but it had all these other characteristics, we would still be beholden to treat it like a human being. So this is Homo sapien characteristics, or human species criteria. But the other things like intelligence, imagination, free will, intentionality, and so forth, all of those things are actually stuff that really make us unique, and they're all phenomenal consciousness related. Phenomenal consciousness is basically that faculty that allows us to experience the world and allows us to have all of these things. And then finally, there's the last category, which is basically phenomenal consciousness in and of itself. There are secular philosophers who demand that we have, or that say that we have and demand of a being, second-order phenomenal consciousness. We have the ability to think about our thoughts. We have the ability to reflect on who we are much more than an animal can. I can think about how you perceive me. Okay, animals can't get there with their kind of self-awareness. And then we have things that the religious people call Tselem Elokim or Neshama. I believe that these all fall in the same category. We'll touch on that in just another slide. But basically, if you look at this, what I'm saying is that consciousness is the fundamental criteria for human, or I would say moral agency. Consciousness is the property or faculty of the mind, which some call the soul. And so here, I would like to digress for a moment and explain why I believe that soul and mind are both exactly the same thing. The term consciousness was really explained in the Enlightenment by John Locke in 1690 when he said, consciousness is the perception of what passes in a man's own mind. So this idea of consciousness in a mind is something new to the Enlightenment. John Hale, who writes in his textbook on philosophy of mind, he says basically the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, basically everybody until the Enlightenment, when they referred to consciousness, they referred to the soul. And basically, the Enlightenment came up with this term mind to replace soul because to get rid of all the religious baggage. He says here, soul has moral and religious overtones that mind doesn't. So when secular people talk about the mind, religious people will talk about the soul. They're the same thing. And really, even in religious literature, we find this equation. There's way too many sources, unfortunately, for me to go through right now. I'll just bring you one line from the Ramban. The Ramban, when he's commenting on that God created us lenefesh chaya, a living soul. So he says, what is this thing? So he says, ki b'neshama azot yaskil v'yidaber. With this soul, with this substance, okay, that God gave us, we will be intelligent. We will think. And we will learn and we will speak. And at that time, of course, there were no NLPs, there was no AI that could do speaking. Anybody who spoke was a human being with a soul. The soul was thought to give the power of speech. Today we call it second-order phenomenal consciousness. Uba ya'aseh kol ma'aseh. And with this thing that the religious people call the soul and secular people call the mind, we do everything that we do as human beings. There's many more sources that we could go to show this equation, but let's move on. So I asked, what's the moral status of a conscious robot? The answer is very simple. It's like a human being. If consciousness is what makes us unique, and some other being has consciousness, they have the moral agency that human beings do. This is really not a deep philosophical question. This is really a simple logical question. If it has consciousness, it's a human being. That's it. What's really difficult is should we be creating such beings? Okay, and this question is being dealt with by philosophers and computer sciences, and anybody who's hearing about it. I could go through all these quotes, it's just half of them. I'll read just the first one by a guy named Signorelli, who's a computer scientist and also dabbles in philosophy. He says, as to the question to whether or not to create sentient AI, would be essentially an ethical question at the same level or even more intractable than cloning animals. So this is a really serious question, and this is the question that I want to bring some of these sources to bear to try to see if Jewish thought has any relevance for this almost science fiction question. To answer the question, it divides into two categories. So there are we talking about a new species or are we talking about a human species? We said that human species are characterized by being born of a mother. The mother and father contribute genetic material. We're talking about a biological creation. So if we're infocentrists and we believe that we can get consciousness to emerge from a super powerful computer platform, we're talking about a new species. But if we're talking about building some kind of biological golem that's based on DNA, so we're talking about a human species. Now, to address whether we should or should not be making this new species, there's a classic prohibition in Parshat Kedoshim, in the book of Leviticus, that says we are not allowed to make new things in mixtures, what we call in Hebrew kilayim. Okay? You're not allowed to make new species. And the Ramban quotes, or the Ramban actually explains the idea and says, "Hamarkiv shnei minin mishaneh umakhish b'maaseh breshit." So he says, if you bring some kind of new species to the world, you're basically changing the fabric of creation, and you're denying God's creation. God put you here to do something with the creation that exists. Now, we heard from Chava that in fact, we are supposed to, from quoting Rav Jonathan Sachs, that we are supposed to try to improve the world. In fact, we are tasked with tikkun olam. We are supposed to do everything to improve our lot and to improve the lot of humanity. However, Rav David Bleich, who talks in the context of cloning, so he says man's creative power, at least to the extent that it does not involve creation of a novel species, is extolled in rabbinic sources. So what he's saying here is, yes, tikkun olam, fix the world, do everything you can, science, technology, nonstop, to a limit. And that limit is creating a new species. That's where God, as it were, in this prohibition, would be drawing the line that we can't go further. So I would have to say that, at least based on this interpretation of the Ramban, you can't create an infocentric conscious robot. But what about a biocentric conscious robot? So here the Golem literature comes to our aid. The most famous and actually the seminal first Golem to appear in Jewish literature is the Gemara in Sanhedrin, Daf Samachay Amud Bet. It says, Amar Rava, I ba'u tzadikei baru alma. So Rava, this great sage, comes and he says that if the righteous of the world would want to create a human being, he says create the world, but every human being is a world in himself. He's talking about creating a human. He says if the righteous would want to do that, they could do it. And so the Radziner Rebbe says, let's not even make a mistake here. He's talking about Adam Mamash, a real person, b'shleimut, in his completion, bli hevdel me Adam she'abara Hashem yitbarach. What we're talking about here is making a human being just like God created Adam. So this brought Rav Bleich to write as follows. The Gemara, he's talking about this Gemara, ascribes the power of creation to the righteous in terminology that is entirely matter of fact. There is no hint that such power should not be utilized. And in fact, Professor Moshe Idel, in his encyclopedic book, The Golem, brings a story. It's a unique story in all the Midrashim. It was written, according to Professor Idel, between the 2nd and 3rd century. It's found in Rabbi Yehuda Chassid's writings. It talks about making a golem that Yirmiyahu Navi and Ben Sira made, and it says, "Nivra lahem Adam acher," or Adam achad. Slicha. And they made an actual person, and the person actually goes on to speak to them. So from these sources, it would seem very clear, that we can make a biocentric humanoid, conscious humanoid. But I would like to revisit the Gemara and take issue with Rav Bleich's reading. You see, I think that he was reading it a little bit narrow. I think he was reading it under the influence of trying to talk about cloning and finding a way to allow cloning. If we look at this first statement, it says, Amar Rava I ba'u tzadikei baru alma. If the righteous would come, they could create a human being. But what are these righteous? What is this righteous that could come and do that? So Rashi explains, Liyot nikiim mikol avon. We're not talking about nice people. We're talking about an individual who has no sin. Not a little sin, not one sin, not a kind of a sin. Nikiim mikol avon. Okay, this is like the perfect individual. But we know such an individual does not exist. Kohelet says clearly, Ki Adam ein tzadik ba'aretz asher yaseh tov v'lo yecheta. So what I want to claim here is that this Gemara is coming to demonstrate that you can't create a conscious humanoid. I want to say that Rava perhaps wanted to say, maybe I am that person. Maybe. And in fact, all of the Golem literature throughout the Middle Ages talks about rabbis who wanted to show that maybe I really am that perfect individual. I'm going to make a Golem. Not for any other reason, but to demonstrate that I've reached it. Okay? But this Gemara goes on and shows that Rava didn't make it. Because it says following as follows. Rabba bara gavra. So Rava made his Golem. He said, a tzaddik could do it and I'm going to do it, and he did it. Shavri lakame the Rebbe Zera. He sent it to his friend Rebbe Zera. Havakam ishtai bahade. So Rebbe Zera opened up a conversation with this Golem, with this Gavra. Velo havakam haderle. But the Golem didn't answer. So Rebbe Zera said, Amarle min chavraya ata hader la'afrecha. He said, evidently you are not a human being, and so return to your dust. You were made by my friends, there's a little antic, and I'm not interested in playing the game. Okay, why did he kill him? Okay, fine. So they made him. If you send me a robot, I wouldn't destroy it. I'll say, oh, okay, funny guys. I mean, what happened here that he killed it? So the Maharsha says that, first of all, Reb Zera was able to identify this wasn't a human being because it didn't speak. And as we said before NLPs, the only beings that could speak were human beings that had a neshama that was behind, or a mind that was behind the ability to speak. And so he detected that it had a soul of a behemah. It had an animal soul, and if it's just an animal, I'm going to kill it. What I want to say here is that Reb Zera is not just killing it because it's an animal. Reb Zera is saying this is beyond the pale. Okay, this is not what we're supposed to be doing. And so if it was a human, if it did actually answer him, I don't think that Rebbe Zera would have said, oh wow, Rava, you did it. No. I think he would have gone back to Rava and he would have said, what are you thinking about? You killed me on Purim and brought me back to life. Now you're making people drop it already. That's what I think this Gemara is saying.
Would he kill him?
Excuse me?
Would he kill him?
Yeah, he wouldn't have killed him because it's a human being already. So he couldn't kill it with a neshama. Now I'm in trouble. But with the soul of a beimah, so no problem. And that, what I just said, is 100% supported by that midrash that I brought to you from Professor Edel from the 2nd century. This golem that they created actually spoke to them. It says as follows: V'nivra lahem adam echad, v'katuv v'mitzcho Hashem Elokim emet. Some of the versions say it just said emet. On his forehead, it had the letters Aleph Mem Tet, emet, and that's how it came to life. Ubiyado sakin echad v'aya mochek Aleph shel emet. And there was a knife in the hand of this golem, and he's scratching away the Aleph. So what's left? Met, death. Basically, the golem came to life and tried to commit suicide. So Ben Sira and Yirmiyahu said, wait, what are you doing? We worked so hard 3 years. Why are you killing yourself? So the golem looked him in the eye and said, what do you think you're doing? You have no business creating me. This is the business of God. You can read the text. I'm saying it in the modern vernacular. In any case, at the end, he says, Yachzaru lachem. Turn around, go back, drop this. You have no business creating a conscious humanoid. And so, basically, the story goes on with all of the golems that have run amok throughout medieval literature. The most famous is that of the Maharal of Prague. For many of you who haven't read the investigation, so the Maharal of Prague had nothing to do with this golem, but nevertheless, it's attributed to him. The story, as brought by Gershom Shalom, talks about how the golem ran amok. Basically, all of the golems throughout history have run amok. And so, if we take this as a precedence within Jewish literature, starting with Rava, going through all the ones that I didn't go through, ending up with the Maharal and Rabbi Eliyahu Baal Shem, basically none of them succeeded in making a second-order phenomenal conscious robot. They were all sentient on the animal level. They all ran amok. The only one that did have human-level consciousness told them to desist. And so with all this, I would say we have no business creating conscious-level humanoid robots. And that's basically the answer, I think. Therefore, I should not be manufactured. I have a whole other piece on this about what if we did and how they would be slaves and so forth. But I think that's enough to show you that, in fact, Jewish thought does have relevance even for such a science fiction topic. Thank you very much.